The worst part of working the graveyard shift isn't the sleep deprivation. It's the suffocating, unnatural silence. It's a heavy, physical thing that presses against your eardrums, playing tricks on your mind until you start hearing footsteps in the mechanical hum of the refrigeration units or whispers in the rattle of the AC vents. I was 21, working the register at a massive, isolated truck stop right off Interstate 80 in Wyoming. It was a liminal space, a sprawling island of harsh fluorescent light surrounded by nothing but hundreds of miles of empty, frozen plains. It was mid-January, and a brutal blizzard had swept through hours ago, shutting down the eastbound lanes entirely. Because of the weather, the station was completely, utterly dead. It was 3:15 a.m. I had already finished my menial tasks, mopped the slush from the linoleum floors, front-faced the rows of potato chips, stocked the glass coolers, and was sitting on a stool behind the high counter, reading a battered paperback book. I was just running out the clock, waiting for my relief to show up at 6 a.m. so I could go crawl into my warm bed. Then, the heavy, rhythmic clank of the driveway bell echoed through the empty store. Ding, ding. I jolted, dropping my book. I looked up at the grainy security monitors mounted above the cigarette rack. A rusted-out dark blue sedan had just pulled over the sensor hose at pump number 4. It was the pump furthest away from the main building, sitting right on the desolate edge of the property, where the harsh glare of the canopy lights faded into the swirling black snow of the blizzard. I set my book aside and waited for the driver to get out, swipe his card, and start pumping. A minute passed, then 2. The car just sat there. I could see thick, white exhaust billowing from the tailpipe, instantly snatched away by the howling wind, but the doors remained shut. I leaned over the counter, squinting through the large glass windows of the storefront. The windows of the sedan were heavily tinted, making it impossible to see inside under normal circumstances, but the angle of the overhead lights illuminated just enough. I could barely make out the silhouette of the driver. He wasn't reaching for his wallet. He wasn't checking his phone. He was sitting perfectly rigid behind the wheel, staring directly at the brightly lit store, staring directly at me. A cold prickle of unease washed over the back of my neck, raising the hairs on my arms. Corporate protocol dictated that if a customer lingered at a pump, I was supposed to hit the intercom and politely ask if they needed assistance, but my hand hovered over the button and stopped. My gut was screaming at me not to engage. 5 minutes passed. The sheer unnaturalness of the situation was paralyzing. The wind rattled the large plate glass windows of the storefront. People do not pull up to a gas pump at 3 a.m. in a blinding blizzard just to sit and stare. Suddenly, the driver's side door clicked open. A man stepped out into the freezing wind. The temperature outside was in the negative teens with the wind chill, but he wasn't wearing a winter coat. He wasn't even wearing a long-sleeved shirt. He was just wearing a filthy, oversized gray t-shirt and dark, stained jeans. He was impossibly thin, his collarbones jutting sharply against the fabric of his shirt, his skin a sickening pale yellow under the harsh fluorescent lights. He didn't walk toward the pump. He didn't reach for the gas nozzle. He slowly closed his car door, turned his body rigidly, and began walking toward the main building. His gait was terrifying. It wasn't a walk. It was a slow, deliberate, disjointed shuffle. He dragged his left foot slightly, scraping it against the snow-covered concrete. His arms hung limply at his sides, swaying with dead weight. But as he crossed under the brighter lights of the canopy, I saw his face. That was the most horrifying detail of all. His eyes were wide open, bulging and unblinking, and he had a massive, exaggerated smile plastered across his face. It wasn't a friendly smile. It wasn't even a human smile. It was a manic, ear-to-ear grimace that bared all his teeth, his gums pale and exposed. Pure primal panic seized my chest. I ducked down below the counter, my knees hitting the floor hard, and frantically crawled toward the front entrance. At 2 a.m.,
I usually locked the sliding glass doors and only did business through the bulletproof night pay window, but I had gone outside to salt the walkway earlier and left them unlocked. I reached up, grabbed the handles of the sliding doors, pulled them tight, and violently threw the heavy metal deadbolt into place. I sank back to the floor, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird, just as a tall, heavy shadow fell over the entrance. I held my breath. I pressed my back against the ice-cold glass of the door, terrified to make a sound. Tap, tap, tap. It was a slow, rhythmic tapping on the glass right above my head. It sounded like fingernails against a chalkboard. I squeezed my eyes shut, praying he would just go away. Tap, tap, tap. Trembling, I slowly turned and peeked over the bottom edge of the doorframe. The man was standing inches away from the glass. He was pressing his face so close to the pane that his nose was nearly touching it, his breath fogging the glass in rhythmic, cloudy puffs. That horrific, unnatural smile hadn't faltered for a second. It looked like it was carved in his face. His wide, unblinking eyes tracked me as I moved, completely devoid of any human warmth or sanity. "Store's closed!" I yelled, my voice cracking violently, sounding thin and pathetic over the howling wind outside. He didn't stop smiling. He didn't speak. He didn't even blink. He just slowly raised his right hand, his joints popping audibly through the glass, and pointed a long, dirty finger over his shoulder, back toward his car at pump number 4. I didn't want to look. I wanted to look away, but my eyes followed his finger. I looked past him, out into the swirling snow. The trunk of the rusted-out dark blue sedan was slowly popping open. It hadn't been unlatched from the outside. Something was pushing it open from the inside.
In the dim, snowy light, I saw a hand emerge from the dark gap in the trunk. It was a small, pale hand, the fingers raw and red from the cold, trembling violently. It gripped the edge of the metal trunk lid, trying to push it wider. My blood ran completely cold. The breath left my lungs in a sharp gasp. I scrambled backward on my hands and knees, ignoring the man at the door, and vaulted behind the safety of the main counter. I grabbed the heavy metal landline phone from under the register and wildly punched in 911. 911, what is your emergency? A calm, metallic voice answered. I need police immediately, I whispered frantically, keeping my head down. I'm at the Flying J on I-80, exit 214. There's a man at my station. He's trying to get in, and I think he has someone in his trunk. A kid, maybe a woman. I saw a hand. As I spoke the words, the power to the entire gas station abruptly cut out. The heavy hum of the refrigerators died. The bright canopy lights outside shut off. The glowing price signs on the highway went dark. The store was instantly plunged into absolute, pitch-black darkness. The emergency backup lights didn't kick on. He hadn't just blown a fuse. He had found the main breaker box outside and destroyed it. "Hello? Are you still there?" The dispatcher's voice crackled loudly through the receiver. Before I could answer, a massive, thunderous crash shattered the silence. The sound of bending aluminum and exploding glass echoed through the empty store. The man had thrown something incredibly heavy, a cinder block, a trash can, I didn't know, straight through the glass front doors. Shards of safety glass rained down on the linoleum floor like a waterfall of ice. The freezing blizzard wind immediately howled into the store, blowing displays over and sending loose receipts swirling into the dark. I dropped the phone, letting it dangle by its cord. I scrambled backward, entirely blind in the dark, and sprinted toward the back office. I barked my shin against a display rack, ignoring the sharp pain, and threw my weight against the heavy steel security door of the manager's office. I slammed it shut behind me, threw the deadbolt, locked the handle, and frantically pushed a heavy metal filing cabinet in front of it. I sank to the floor in the pitch-black room, pulling my knees to my chest, hyperventilating.
I covered my mouth with both hands to muffle the sound of my own terrified breathing. I listened. Over the howling wind, I heard it. Crunch, drag, crunch, drag. It was the sound of his wet, shuffling footsteps crunching heavily over the broken glass in the front door. He was walking through the aisles. He didn't seem to be looking for the register. He wasn't rummaging for cigarettes or cash. The footsteps moved slowly, deliberately, bypassing the front counter entirely. They were coming straight down the narrow hallway toward the back office. Crunch, drag. The footsteps stopped right outside the steel door. The brass doorknob slowly, agonizingly turned. It rattled against the lock. I squeezed my eyes shut in the dark, tears streaming down my face, gripping a heavy metal Maglite flashlight I kept under the desk. Then, that terrifying, manic voice spoke from the other side of the steel. It wasn't angry. It wasn't yelling. It was completely flat, a soft, raspy whisper, totally devoid of emotion. She was supposed to be asleep, but she woke up, and now you're awake too. He began violently pounding his fists against the steel. It wasn't frantic, desperate. It was heavy, rhythmic, and mechanical. Bang, bang, bang. The thick metal vibrated with the sheer, impossible force of his blows. Dust fell from the ceiling tiles onto my hair. He pounded endlessly, tirelessly, for what felt like hours, a relentless drumbeat of pure terror, while I cowered in the corner, waiting for the hinges to give way. Suddenly, mid-strike, the pounding stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. I stayed frozen, my knuckles white around the flashlight. Minutes ticked by. Then, cutting through the wail of the blizzard outside, I heard the faint, beautiful sound of approaching sirens. The red and blue lights washed over the snowy windows of the office, painting the dark room in frantic, strobe-like flashes. I heard the muffled shouts of police officers breaching the front of the store, their heavy boots crunching on the glass. "Police, anyone in here?" I pushed the filing cabinet away and threw open the door, practically falling into the arms of a terrified-looking deputy. By the time they had arrived, the smiling man was gone. The officers searched the perimeter with flashlights and drawn weapons. They found his rusted sedan still sitting at Pump 4, abandoned, the engine finally dead. The trunk was wide open, the lid swaying slightly in the freezing wind, and it was completely empty. They found the main breaker box on the side of the building smashed to pieces with a heavy tire iron. The police launched a massive manhunt that night, calling in state troopers and setting up roadblocks, but the heavy snow of the blizzard had already covered his tracks. It was as if he had just walked out into the freezing void and vanished. They never found the man with the smile, and despite missing persons reports flooding in from 3 neighboring states, they never found whoever was trembling in that trunk. I handed over my keys to the manager when he arrived at dawn to assess the damage. I quit my job right there in the parking lot. I moved back with my parents, I lock every door twice, and to this day, I refuse to ever drive at night again.
The low fuel light is arguably the most terrifying dashboard warning you can get, but it reaches an entirely new level of horror when you're driving through the pitch-black Nevada desert at 2 a.m. I was a 24-year-old female making the grueling cross-country drive from Colorado to California to move in with my fiancé. I had severely miscalculated the distance between towns on Highway 50, a stretch of asphalt famously and accurately known as the loneliest road in America. I had been driving for 3 solid hours without seeing a single pair of headlights, a single house, or even a glimmer of civilization on the horizon. There was nothing but the hypnotic,
endless drone of my tires on the pavement, and the suffocating darkness pressing against my windows. When my fuel gauge hit absolute zero, a cold, sinking panic set in. The glowing orange light on my dashboard felt like a spotlight mocking my stupidity. My engine gave a harsh, violent sputter, hesitating for a terrifying second before catching again. I gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. Just as I was preparing to pull over to the dark, gravel shoulder and accept my bleak fate of sleeping in a freezing car, vulnerable to whatever was out there, I saw it. A faint, flickering yellow glow broke through the ink-black distance. It was an ancient, independent gas station that looked like it had been violently ripped out of the 1980s and left to rot. The metal canopy was rusted at the edges, and only 2 of the 4 long fluorescent lights were working. They constantly buzzed and flickered, casting a sickly, strobing yellow light over the cracked concrete island. There were 2 analog gas pumps, the heavy, boxy kind, with the physical spinning numbers and faded, peeling decals. I coasted into the lot on pure fumes, put my car in park, and let out a massive, trembling sigh of relief. I grabbed my purse from the passenger seat and pushed my door open, stepping out into the cool, arid desert night air. The silence immediately swallowed me. It was deafening. There were no other cars in the lot, no crickets chirping in the brush, no wind blowing through the scrub oak. There was just the oppressive, electric hum of the flickering lights above my head, sounding like a swarm of angry hornets. I walked up to the pump and lifted the heavy metal nozzle, the rubber hose stiff from the cold. I looked for a slot to slide my card, but there was no credit card reader. Instead, a handwritten, weather-beaten piece of cardboard was taped over the dial. In thick, faded black marker, it read, "Pay inside before pumping." I looked up at the main building. It was a small, square cinder block structure, painted a peeling, faded beige. The front windows were covered in heavy, rusted iron security bars, and the glass itself was so thickly coated in years of desert dust and grime that I couldn't see anything inside. A single, dim, bare light bulb burned in the very back of the store, casting long, distorted shadows across the ceiling. Every instinct I had, every primal alarm bell ringing in my head, told me to get back in my car, lock the doors, and wait for daylight. But my car was completely dead. If I wanted to get out of this wasteland, I had absolutely no choice. I pulled my jacket tighter around me and walked up to the heavy glass door. I grabbed the tarnished metal handle and pushed it open. An electronic chime echoed sharply through the small, cramped store. Bing bong! The smell hit me instantly, nearly making me gag. It smelled like stale, decades-old cigarettes, acrid motor oil, and something else, something sickly sweet and metallic, like rotting fruit mixed with old pennies. The aisles were claustrophobically narrow, crammed to the ceiling with dusty bags of chips, faded boxes of spark plugs, and sun-bleached quarts of motor oil. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding small and fragile in the dead air. No answer. I swallowed hard and walked slowly down the center aisle toward the register. The counter was incredibly high, built with thick, cloudy, bulletproof glass enclosing the cashier's entire area. It looked like a setup for a bank in a bad neighborhood, not a rural gas station. I popped up to my tiptoes to look through the small circular speaking hole cut into the center of the glass. The door behind the register, leading to the back room, was cracked open, revealing a pitch-black hallway. "Excuse me, I need to prepay for pump 2, I said, a little louder this time, tapping a coin against the metal slide tray beneath the glass. Silence.
I pulled a crisp $20 bill from my wallet, intending to shove it through the metal tray, pump my gas, and get the hell out of there as fast as humanly possible. But as I leaned forward to slide the bill into the slot, my eyes caught a shape resting on the floor behind the counter. It was a man's heavy leather work boot. I leaned closer, pressing my face against the cold, thick glass to get a better angle, The boot was attached to a leg clad in blue jeans. Someone was lying perfectly still on the linoleum floor behind the register, hidden from the view of the front door. "Sir, are you okay?" I asked, my voice trembling wildly now. I thought maybe the attendant had suffered a heart attack or tripped and hit his head. The leg didn't move, but slowly, agonizingly slowly, a hand reached out from the pitch-black hallway behind the register. It was a massive, filthy hand, the knuckles scarred and the fingernails caked in black grease. It gripped the edge of the doorframe so hard the knuckles turned white. Then a man stepped out of the shadows. He wasn't wearing a uniform. He wasn't wearing a name tag. He was wearing a dark, heavy mechanic's jumpsuit that was violently stained down the front with thick, dark fluid. He was massive, easily over 6'5", his broad shoulders filling the doorway. He didn't even look at me. He walked casually over to the man lying on the floor, grabbed him roughly by the collar of his shirt, and violently dragged the unconscious or dead attendant backward. The man's heels scraped sickeningly against the linoleum before they both disappeared into the dark hallway. My heart completely stopped. The blood drained from my face. I was entirely alone, miles from anywhere, in the middle of the desert, with a murderer. The massive man emerged from the hallway again. He turned and walked slowly up to the bulletproof glass. He stared down at me through the smudged partition. His eyes were entirely bloodshot, the whites completely red, and he was breathing heavily through his nose, his chest heaving under the stained jumpsuit. He didn't speak. He slowly looked down at the $20 bill I had unknowingly left resting in the metal slide tray. He pushed the heavy metal tray open from his side, took the bill between two massive fingers, and smiled. It wasn't a friendly smile. It was a terrifying, dead-eyed, predatory grin that bared yellowed teeth. "Pump 2 is on," he said. His voice was a low, gravelly rasp that sounded like rocks grinding together. In a fraction of a second, the horrific reality of the situation clicked in my brain. He wasn't going to attack me inside the store. The bulletproof glass was too thick, and the heavy security door leading into the register booth was deadbolted from the inside. He was going to let me go outside, where I was completely exposed in the dark, so I could pump the gas he just authorized. I didn't say a word. I knew if I screamed or ran, he would know I was onto him. I slowly backed away from the counter, step by step, my wide eyes locked on his. He just stood there behind the glass, perfectly still, watching me with that terrifying smile plastered on his face. I turned and walked toward the front doors. I forced myself not to run, fighting every screaming instinct in my body that begged me to sprint. I pushed the heavy glass door open, the chime echoing behind me like a death knell. Bing bong! I stepped out into the freezing, flickering yellow light of the canopy. I walked to my car, my hands shaking so violently I dropped my keys twice on the concrete. I scooped them up, grabbed the heavy, cold nozzle from the pump, inserted it into my tank, and squeezed the metal handle. Nothing happened. There was no rush of fluid. The motor inside the pump didn't hum. I squeezed it again, frantically pumping the handle. The physical numbers on the dial didn't move. No gas flowed into my car. He hadn't turned the pump on. I froze. A wave of pure, ice-cold terror washed over me. I slowly looked up from the pump to the cinder block building. Through the dusty, barred windows, I saw a huge, heavy shadow moving quickly. He wasn't behind the register anymore. He was moving swiftly through the aisles, heading toward the solid steel side door of the building. He had lured me out of the store to trap me at my car. I threw the metal nozzle to the ground, not caring where it landed. I ripped my car door open, threw myself into the driver's seat, and slammed my palm against the lock button. The heavy clack of the doors locking echoed in the small cabin. Just a second later, I heard the heavy metal security side door crash open, slamming violently against the cinder block wall. Heavy, thundering footsteps hit the loose gravel, sprinting full speed towards my car. I jammed my key into the ignition and twisted it with everything I had. The engine sputtered, whining pitifully, desperately trying to pull the absolute last fumes of gasoline from the dry lines. Chug, chug, chug. "Come on! Come on! Come on!" I screamed out loud, tears of panic blurring my vision. The man rounded the back of my car. I saw his massive, hulking silhouette suddenly appear in my rearview mirror. He was sprinting now, and in his right hand, he was holding a heavy, rusted steel tire iron. I slammed the gas pedal violently. The tires spun wildly in the loose gravel, kicking rocks and dust back at him, just as they finally screamed as they gained traction on the asphalt. I tore out of the parking lot, hitting the pitch-black asphalt of Highway 50 at 60 miles an hour. Just as my car lurched forward, I heard the deafening, sickening crack of the heavy steel tire iron smashing violently against my rear bumper. I didn't look back. I drove for 20 agonizing miles in the pitch black, my foot pinned to the floor, hyperventilating, and terrified my engine would die at any second, leaving me stranded in the dark for him to find me. By some absolute, inexplicable miracle of engineering, my car coasted off an off-ramp and into a large, well-lit, heavily populated truck stop, just as the engine finally gave a violent shudder and died completely in the parking lot. I kicked my door open and ran inside, hysterically screaming for the cashier to lock the doors and call the police. When the state troopers went back to the isolated, flickering gas station an hour later with their weapons drawn, it was completely abandoned. The register had been smashed open and cleaned out. The massive man in the jumpsuit was gone, but they found the real attendant bound, gagged, and bleeding heavily in the pitch-black back room. He had been severely beaten, his skull fractured, but he was alive. If I hadn't seen that boot behind the counter, if I had just stood out there in the freezing dark, waiting like a sitting duck at that pump for the gas to turn on, I know exactly where I would have ended up.
Never give out the bathroom key after midnight. That was the single most important rule my manager drilled into my head on my very first day. He didn't just say it, he practically carved it into my brain. The bathrooms at our station were located entirely around the back of the cinder block building, down a narrow alleyway that was completely out of sight from the main register in the street. At night, that blind spot became a haven for drug addicts, transients, and people you simply did not want to interact with. I was 19, working the overnight shift at a busy, independent gas station right off a major exit ramp in urban Ohio. It was a heavily trafficked area during the day, but at night, the station took on a grim, threatening atmosphere. The canopy lighting was harsh and buzzing, the corners of the lot were swallowed by shadows, and the woods creeping up right behind the property line felt entirely too close. To enforce the golden rule, we kept the bathroom key attached to a massive, heavy, rusted Ford hubcap sitting on the floor behind the counter, specifically so people couldn't casually pocket it or demand it without us noticing. It was a suffocatingly humid Tuesday night in August, right around 2 a.m. The air conditioner inside the store was fighting a losing battle against the heat radiating off the blacktop outside. The front door chime echoed sharply. A woman walked into the store. She looked to be in her late 20s, and despite the 90-degree heat, she was wearing a thick, torn beige trench coat. She was trembling violently. Her mascara was smeared down her cheeks, and she kept darting her eyes around, looking frantically over her shoulder out the front glass windows every 2 seconds, like she was being hunted. She practically collapsed against the front counter, her tears streaming down her pale face, her breathing shallow and ragged.
Please, she whispered frantically, her voice cracking as her shaking hands gripped the edge of the counter. Please, I need the bathroom key. He's coming. He's right behind me. I just need to lock myself in and hide. Please. My heart instantly went out to her. It was a direct, fireable violation of store policy, but I was a 19-year-old girl, and she looked genuinely, utterly terrified. I immediately assumed she was escaping a violently abusive partner. Okay, it's fine, I said, reaching down and heaving the heavy metal hubcap onto the counter. The brass key jingled against the rim. It's around the back of the building, down the right side. Go, lock the door behind you. I won't tell anyone you're in there, I promise. She grabbed the hubcap, let out a wet, sobbing thank you, and sprinted out the front doors, her heavy coat swooshing as she disappeared around the dark corner of the building. I immediately looked up at the grainy security monitors above the cigarette rack. The camera pointing down the side alley saw her running to the heavy metal door of the women's restroom. She frantically fumbled with the key, unlocked it, slipped inside into the darkness, and pulled the heavy door shut behind her. I grabbed the heavy metal landline phone, ready to dial 911 the second her pursuer showed up. I waited. 10 minutes passed. The heavy, rhythmic hum of the refrigerators was the only sound in the store. Nobody pulled into the lot. Nobody walked past the large glass windows. 30 minutes passed. The station was completely, unnervingly dead. The heat seemed to press against the glass. At the 45-minute mark, a different kind of dread started to pool in my stomach. Was she okay? Had she overdosed in there? Was she having a medical emergency? If she died in that bathroom because I broke the rules, it would be entirely my fault.
I decided I had no choice but to go check on her. I locked the front register, grabbed my heavy metal Maglite flashlight from under the counter, and walked out the front sliding doors. The humidity hit me like a physical wall. It was thick and hard to breathe. The cicadas were screaming endlessly in the dark woods behind the station, a grating electric sound that set my teeth on edge. I walked slowly around the corner of the building, my flashlight beam cutting through the muggy air, and headed down the narrow, poorly lit alleyway that led to the restrooms. The smell of hot asphalt and stale garbage was overpowering. I reached the heavy, dented metal door of the women's restroom. I didn't knock right away. Instead, I pressed my ear against the warm, painted steel, listening for crying or the sound of someone being sick. Instead, I heard a sound that made the blood freeze in my veins. It was a voice, a man's voice. It was very low, very calm, and incredibly deep. It wasn't angry. It was terrifyingly conversational. "You did perfectly," the man's voice whispered through the metal door, echoing slightly against the tile inside. "Now we just wait for her to open the door." A wave of paralyzing, ice-cold horror washed over me, rooting my feet to the concrete. The woman hadn't been running from an abuser. She hadn't been terrified. She hadn't been hiding. She was a decoy. I took a slow, silent step backward, desperate to put distance between myself and that door. Crunch. My rubber sole dragged against a small piece of loose gravel on the concrete. It was barely a sound at all, but in the dead of night, it was loud enough. The voices inside the bathroom stopped instantly. A suffocating silence fell over the alleyway. The cicadas in the trees suddenly seemed deafening. "She's out there," the man's voice whispered, much louder this time, right on the other side of the steel. The heavy deadbolt on the inside of the door violently clicked open. The brass handle started to turn. I didn't wait to see what was going to come out of that dark room. I turned and sprinted blindly down the dark alleyway. I heard the heavy metal door tear open behind me, slamming hard against the cinder block wall. It was immediately followed by the heavy, thundering sound of heavy work boots hitting the concrete, giving chase.
I ran faster than I ever had in my entire life, my lungs burning, the heavy flashlight swinging wildly in my hand. I rounded the front corner of the building so fast, I nearly slipped on a patch of spilled oil, my arms windmilling to keep my balance. I threw myself toward the brightly lit storefront, yanked the heavy glass door open, threw myself inside, and slammed it shut behind me. I reached up and violently threw the heavy deadbolt into place, collapsing backward against the front counter, gasping for air, my heart threatening to crack my ribs. I looked up through the glass front doors. Standing perfectly still in the harsh, flickering white light of the gas canopy, staring at me through the glass, was a man. He was incredibly tall, heavily built, and wearing a dark, featureless ski mask that completely obscured his face. Beside him stood the woman in the trench coat. She wasn't crying anymore. She wasn't trembling. Her face was completely blank, totally devoid of any humanity, her eyes dead and flat as they locked onto mine. The massive man stared at me through the glass for a long, agonizing moment. He didn't try the door handle. He didn't bang on the glass. He just slowly raised his right hand, pointed his index finger directly at my face like the barrel of a gun, and dropped his thumb. They turned in unison and walked casually away, stepping off the pavement and disappearing into the pitch-black woods behind the station. I crawled behind the counter and dialed 911, sobbing hysterically into the receiver. By the time the police cruisers swarmed the lot, their red and blue lights flashing against the trees, the woods were completely empty. The officers drew their weapons and cleared the bathroom. The man and the woman were gone, but they hadn't left empty-handed. When the police searched the bathroom floor, right behind the door, they found a massive roll of heavy-duty silver duct tape, a bundle of thick plastic zip ties, and a medical syringe filled with an unknown clear liquid. The detective who took my statement later that morning looked grim. He told me that human traffickers and predators often use desperate, strung-out addicts as bait. They use them to play on the sympathies of female gas station or motel attendants, luring them out of the safety of a locked, camera-monitored store and into the dark blind spots of the property. If I had knocked on that door to check on her, or if I had tried to be helpful and open it from the outside with my master key, the man waiting behind it would have dragged me inside. I would have been subdued, bound, and thrown into a vehicle parked in the woods before anyone even knew I was missing. I handed my manager my uniform shirt when the sun came up. I never gave out the bathroom key again. In fact, I never worked another night shift in my entire life.
There is an inherent, deeply ingrained trust we are conditioned from childhood to place in uniforms. When you see a police badge, a fire helmet, or a paramedic's jacket, your brain automatically bypasses its normal threat assessment protocols. It assumes safety. It assumes authority. Predators know this, and the smart ones use it to slip past your defenses before you even realize you're in danger. I worked the graveyard shift at an incredibly isolated gas station in rural, deep West Texas. We were the only illuminated stop for almost 40 miles on a desolate, arrow-straight stretch of two-lane highway. The station was a small, independent relic from the 1970s. No bulletproof glass, no automatic magnetic locks, no high-tech security vestibule. It was just a heavy glass door, a standard cash register, and me entirely alone in the dark. It was 1 a.m. on a Friday in mid-July. The heat was still radiating off the asphalt outside. I was in the middle of mopping the scuffed linoleum floors, the smell of bleach heavy in the air, when a pair of headlights suddenly swept across the large front windows. A white SUV pulled off the highway and up to the storefront. It didn't park in a designated spot. It pulled up diagonally, aggressively close to the doors, blocking the walkway. The headlights remained on, blindingly bright halogen beams illuminating the entire front of the store and casting long, harsh shadows against the back wall. I leaned on my mop handle, shielding my eyes from the glare, waiting for the customer to come in. The driver's heavy door swung open, and a man stepped out into the Texas heat. He was wearing a dark blue, short-sleeved police uniform, a heavy-duty black belt with a holstered firearm resting on his hip, and a silver badge pinned to his chest. He was broad-shouldered and walked with a heavy, deliberate, authoritative swagger toward the glass doors. I exhaled, my tense shoulders dropping instantly. I relaxed. Cops and state troopers stopped by all the time on the night shift for free coffee and to use the restroom. It was a comforting presence in the middle of nowhere. The front door chime echoed sharply, and he walked in. "Evening, officer," I said, offering a polite smile and putting the mop away in the yellow bucket. "Coffee is fresh if you want some." He didn't respond immediately. He didn't even look at the coffee pots. He stood near the entrance, his boots planted wide, his hands resting casually on his thick duty belt. His eyes slowly, methodically scanned the entire store. He looked down the aisles, checking the blind spots, and then looked up at the ceiling corners, tracking the cheap dome security cameras. "Quiet night?" he asked. His voice was oddly flat, devoid of the usual tired, friendly drawl of the local deputies. "Yes, sir. Dead as a doornail," I replied, walking behind the high counter of the register. "Just trying to stay awake." He walked slowly down the center aisle, approaching the counter. As he stepped closer, moving directly under the harsh fluorescent overhead light, my brain started throwing silent red flags. Tiny, almost imperceptible details that just didn't make sense. His dark blue...
"My manager is in the back office doing inventory," I lied smoothly, fighting the violent trembling in my hands. My heart was hammering against my ribs so hard, I thought he could hear it. His eyes instantly darted past me, staring down the dark, narrow hallway that led to the restrooms and the employee office. "Is that right?" he murmured, a terrifyingly blank expression settling over his face. "Mind if I go back there and say hello? Doing a routine safety check." "Actually, he's on an important corporate call right now," I said, slowly taking a half step backward, edging toward the wall phone. "I can have him come out when he's done." The man's demeanor changed in a fraction of a second. The fake, authoritative calm vanished completely, replaced by a cold, dead-eyed, aggressive stare. It was the look of a predator realizing its prey knew it was trapped. He didn't say another word. He just slowly raised his right hand and unclipped the metal snap on his cheap nylon holster. Click. "I think I'll just go back and check myself," he whispered, taking a swift, heavy step around the side of the counter. I didn't wait for him to draw the weapon. I didn't hesitate. I slammed the heel of my hand onto the silent panic button, hidden under the lip of the register, turned, and sprinted blindly down the dark hallway. I threw myself into the actual back office, a windowless cinder block room. I slammed the heavy, solid-core wooden door shut, threw the deadbolt, and desperately shoved a massive waist-high stack of full soda syrup boxes in front of it. I heard him vault over the front counter, his heavy boots hitting the linoleum with a sickening thud. Rapid, heavy footsteps thundered down the narrow hallway toward me. He hit the locked door with his shoulder. The entire frame shuddered. The wood groaned and splintered around the strike plate, but the deadbolt held. "Open the door," he roared, his voice completely unhinged now, echoing violently in the cramped hallway. It was a guttural, furious sound. I backed into the furthest corner of the room, my chest heaving, tears of pure terror blurring my vision. I reached into the utility closet and grabbed a heavy, solid steel pipe wrench. I raised it above my head. I was completely trapped. There was no back exit. There were no windows. If he got through that wood, I was going to die in that room. Bang! 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 He started kicking the door violently, right next to the doorknob. The metal hinges shrieked. Dust fell from the ceiling tiles. The barricade of syrup boxes shifted back an inch. "I pressed the panic button," I screamed at the top of my lungs, my voice cracking hysterically through the splintering wood. The silent alarm is tripped. The real cops are on their way right now. They're 5 minutes out. The kicking stopped mid-strike. Complete, suffocating silence fell over the hallway. The only sound was my own frantic, ragged breathing. I held my breath, gripping the heavy wrench so hard my knuckles turned white and my forearms burned. I stared at the doorknob, waiting for the deafening roar of a gunshot to blow the lock apart. Instead, I heard the rapid, heavy scuff of his boots retreating down the hallway. A second later, I heard the electronic chime of the front glass door opening and closing. I scrambled over the desk and stared at the grainy security monitor. The fake cop sprinted out of the store and jumped into the driver's seat of his unmarked white SUV. He threw it into reverse, slammed on the gas, and tore out of the parking lot, his tires squealing violently on the asphalt as he merged onto the pitch-black highway and disappeared into the night. I stayed curled in a ball under that desk, clutching the wrench until the real state troopers arrived 12 minutes later. They breached the store with weapons drawn, finding me shaking in the back office. When the investigators reviewed the security footage, their faces went pale. The man wasn't a local drifter. He was a known, highly violent offender who had recently purchased police surplus gear and a fake badge online. He had been pulling over lone female drivers on dark rural highways across 3 counties for weeks, using the uniform and the spotlight to gain their immediate compliance before kidnapping and assaulting them. Because I happened to notice the missing roof light bar and the cheap nylon holster, I didn't become his next victim, but the psychological scar is permanent. To this day, the thought of how easily he walked right into my store, wearing the very symbol of safety and protection to execute his trap, haunts me. I quit the next morning, and I still suffer severe panic attacks whenever I see flashing lights in my rearview mirror on a dark road.